Welcome back to The Explainer. I'm absolutely thrilled to have you here today. Look, we're going to zoom way out from some incredibly chaotic recent headlines, and we're looking at the massive global supply chain shifts happening literally right beneath our feet. We're breaking down this whole situation all the way from the strikes on Kharag Island to the shifting paradigms of global oil. And, as always, we're keeping it strictly to the facts and the source material. No taking sides here, just structured, objective insights.
Right off the bat, to understand how heated this situation has become, we just need to look at the rhetoric popping up in our source material. There's a quote here illustrating the absolute boiling point of this conflict, literally calling for extreme, permanent measures, even throwing out the idea of tactical nukes. It is incredibly intense, violent rhetoric. But to really grasp this geopolitical chess match, we actually need to step back from the raw emotion of quotes like this and objectively analyze the sequence of events that push things to this brink.
Section 1. The ceasefire collapses. We're looking at the breakdown of the MOU and the rapid escalation of military friction.
Okay, let's dive into this timeline. Our sources show exactly how quickly, lightning fast, this diplomatic effort unraveled. First, the Memorandum of Understanding, the MOU, was signed, and the U.S. released its blockade. Sounds great, right? But almost immediately the whole thing fell apart. By Saturday, 8 ships were intimidated into turning around in the strait. In response to that, the U.S. launched strikes on Kharag Island. And finally, the U.S. Treasury stepped in and revoked that crucial oil waiver. It was just a complete rapid-fire collapse.
So why did it fall apart so fast? Well, the sources highlight this really fascinating, almost two-faced dynamic within the regime itself. On one hand, you have the diplomatic negotiators. These are the folks who actually agreed to the MOU and outwardly sought open straits. But on the other side of the coin, you have the actual military decision-makers. They are the ones holding the real sway here. They're the ones who broke the ceasefire and intimidated those ships. The sources suggest we've essentially been negotiating with people who, well, they simply don't have the power to actually enforce the deal.
And this brings us to the specific post-ceasefire escalations noted in our analysis. Because it wasn't just the intimidation of those 8 ships. No, the sources point to clear evidence of recovery work happening at the Pickaxe Mountain nuclear enterprise site, which completely violates the status quo. On top of that, there were active efforts to recover ballistic missiles. It is a really clear pattern of military escalation happening at the exact same time as these diplomatic promises were being made, which naturally prompted a very swift international response.
Section 2. Rhetoric and Retaliation. Let's examine the swift U.S. response.
That reaction to the broken ceasefire was immediate, and it was forceful. Former President Trump is quoted directly in the source material saying, "They start shooting rockets at ships yesterday, and so we hit them very hard last night, 20 times tougher." He firmly dismissed the whole idea of further negotiations, basically stating it was a waste of time and referring to the opposing military leadership as liars and scum. Regardless of how you look at it, the stance was crystal clear. The time for talking was officially over.
So what did this retaliation actually look like in practice? The sources outline a distinct 1-2 punch strategy. Step 1 was the military strike, hitting Kharag Island assets to send a very loud, very physical message. Step 2 was the economic strike. The U.S. Treasury Department steps in and revokes the authorization that allowed the regime to sell oil internationally using U.S. dollars. It's this combined military and economic pressure campaign applied directly to the regime's main lifelines.
Now, there is a fascinating tactical theory brought up in our sources regarding that Kharag Island strike, specifically involving the oil pipes. Trump explicitly noted that they deliberately preserved the oil pipes during the attack. Why do that? Well, the analysis suggests that by keeping that infrastructure completely intact, the U.S. could potentially take over Kharag Island, re-blockade the area, and actually use the regime's own oil infrastructure to fund the blockade against them. It is a highly calculated maneuver, absolutely designed for maximum long-term leverage.
Section 3. The NATO dynamic. Time to examine the shifting alliances and internal frictions.
Historically, getting unanimous support for Middle Eastern interventions has been, well, incredibly tough. But as this quote from a NATO representative in our sources highlights, the repeated violations of the ceasefire seem to have actually shifted the consensus. The source notes that this long, frustratingly failed negotiation process essentially convinced even reluctant NATO allies that a forceful, coalition-backed reaction was absolutely necessary. It's kind of ironic, but the repeated breaking of trust actually unified the opposition.
But, that unity isn't exactly absolute. The sources reveal some pretty surprising geopolitical drama behind the scenes. While key allies like Germany, France, the UK, and Italy were consulted and engaged in the process, Spain was just completely left out in the cold.
In fact, former President Trump had some incredibly sharp words for Spain, calling them a wasted cause and a terrible partner in NATO. He even threw out the idea of cutting off all trade with them for not carrying their weight. It just goes to show that even within a supposedly unified coalition, the diplomatic friction is intense.
Section 4. Bypassing the Strait. Let's zoom out and look at the macro supply chain shifts.
The climax of this entire situation really comes down to this number right here, $72. Think about it. Despite the revoked sanctions waivers, the targeted military strikes, and the total collapse of the ceasefire, which did cause a brief 5% jump, Brent crude oil ultimately sat comfortably at $72 a barrel. That is way, way below the $100 mark we were seeing earlier this year.
Now, what's really interesting about this data is how it provides a massive market reality check. The economic data completely disproves the fear of a massive global supply shock. Seriously, if the market truly feared that chaos in the Strait of Hormuz would choke off the world's oil, prices would have skyrocketed instantly. The fact that they stabilized at 72 signals a huge loss of geographic leverage for the regime controlling that strait.
So the absolutely crucial question is, why isn't the market panicking? Well, it's because the physical infrastructure of the world is literally changing. OPEC Plus proactively added 188,000 barrels a day to its August quotas, and even more significantly than that, countries are actively building around the problem. The sources point out that a UA pipeline specifically designed to bypass the Strait of Hormuz was already 50% complete way back in May. The strait is just steadily being rendered irrelevant.
Section 5. A new oil paradigm. The grand geopolitical punchline.
The sources describe what they are calling a hemispheric shift. Global buyers who used to rely heavily on Middle Eastern oil flowing straight through that conflict zone, they're now looking elsewhere. They are shifting to Western Hemisphere sources. Specifically, they're increasing their reliance on the United States, Venezuela, and Guyana. The supply chains are literally, physically moving across the globe.
Let's move to our conclusion here and see how this all builds together. Because instead of getting bogged down in this endless cycle of chaos and broken ceasefires, the global market is simply building around it. The entire global oil infrastructure is being rerouted as we speak. The logical conclusion here is that the global economy is quite literally leaving this isolated regime completely behind. The world just doesn't have time to wait around for a reliable deal. It's moving on without them.
Which brings us to a final thought for you to ponder today. We've seen exactly how markets adapt and how massive infrastructure shifts in real time. So, if the global infrastructure simply routes around conflict zones, what happens to the isolated regimes left behind? Do they adapt, or do they simply fade away into economic obscurity? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep learning, keep questioning, and I'll catch you next time.